All right, so we're diving into vampires, a topic that it seems like never gets old. You know, you sent over a ton of research and articles on one film in particular, Nosferatu. And I'm really excited to dig into this to kind of see what is it about this 1922 film that still has a grip on us like a century later.
You know, one of the most fascinating things I think about Nosferatu
Hmm.
is that it wasn't just a horror movie. It was really a reflection of its time. And to really understand its impact, I think we need to kind of start with the historical context. Germany, right after World War I.
Okay, so paint a picture for us.
Yeah.
Germany, 1922. What's going on?
I mean, you have to imagine a country that is just reeling from the war. There's this sense of disillusionment, economic instability, obviously, deep trauma. And, kind of out of all this chaos emerges this new artistic movement.
Called German
The
Expressionism.
German Expressionism. And so how does that tie into everything? Well, it's not just the war, though, right? Think about the 1918 influenza pandemic.
Wow.
You have millions dead worldwide. I mean, that fear was still very fresh in everyone's minds. And so German Expressionism in art and film was really a response to this sort of collective trauma. And it was characterized by these distorted visuals, exaggerated sets, and really unsettling lighting to kind of reflect the anxieties of the time.
And that's where Nosferatu comes in.
Exactly. Just embodies German Expressionism. You look at the film, you see the stark shadows, the jagged landscapes. And it's not just spooky. It's a visual representation of a society that's on edge.
So more than just a vampire flick, it's like this psychological snapshot of post-war Germany.
Exactly. And what makes it even more fascinating is that the director, F.W. Murnau, he originally wanted to adapt Bram Stoker's Dracula directly,
Yeah.
but they couldn't get the rights.
Oh, wow. So they made an unauthorized Dracula movie?
Risky. Yeah, they tried to get clever.
Right.
They changed the names. So Dracula became Count Orlok. Jonathan Harker became Thomas Hutter. But, the story beats were pretty much the same.
Mhm.
And Bram Stoker's estate wasn't fooled. They sued. And almost had all copies of the film destroyed.
Wow. So how did Nosferatu even survive all of that?
Well, luckily, some copies were hidden away. And they resurfaced later, thank goodness, because Nosferatu did something really remarkable. It took that familiar vampire myth and just twisted it into something truly disturbing and uniquely cinematic.
From what I read about Count Orlok, he's nothing like the suave aristocratic Dracula we see in later movies.
Oh, he's a far cry from that image. I mean, Count Orlok, who was played by Max Schreck, he was utterly grotesque. He was gaunt pale with these long claw-like fingers and rat-like features.
That's not the kind of vampire you want to meet in a dark alley.
No, and that was the point. Murnau wasn't interested in romanticizing the vampire. He wanted to tap into something deeper, something more primal. All those anxieties we talked about. Fears of disease, the unknown societal collapse. Orlok embodies all of that.
Yeah, he's like this walking plague, bringing death and misery everywhere he goes.
And that's not a coincidence. His appearance, those rat-like features, the way that he spread death, directly reflect the fears of disease that were so real in post-war Europe.
Yeah, that's what's so interesting. It's like they deliberately made the vampire monstrous, not alluring, to kind of mirror these specific fears of that time.
Absolutely. Now, you think about Dracula itself. It was published in 1897, Victorian era, right? Their anxieties were very different. So what Nosferatu did was it took that basic framework of the vampire myth and completely reinterpreted it for a new era, for a world that had been scarred by war and disease.
So it's not just the story. It's the way Nosferatu tells the story, visually, that makes it so powerful and lasting.
Precisely. And that visual storytelling is what makes Nosferatu such a landmark film. It didn't just give us a new kind of vampire. It established a whole new visual language for horror cinema. Yeah.
When we talk about visual storytelling, one of the things that I always think about with Nosferatu are the shadows. They're just everywhere, lurking in corners, stretching across walls, almost like another character in the film.
It's funny you should say that because the shadows in Nosferatu, they're not just aesthetic choices. They really represent the unseen right, the lurking danger, that fear that can just consume you from the inside out. It's like a visual metaphor for all the psychological trauma that's haunting these characters.
It's like the shadows themselves are almost more monstrous than even Count Orlok.
Exactly. And, that reliance on suggestion, on what you don't see, that's a real hallmark of Nosferatu. And it's something that you see in a lot of effective horror films.
Oh, for sure.
Yeah.
It's like they leave those gruesome details to our imaginations to fill in. And I don't know if you remember that scene where Orlok's shadow creeps up the stairs, slowly reaching toward the bedroom door. It's so simple, but it's so incredibly chilling you never actually see the attack. But the implication, it's enough to send shivers down your spine.
It's a perfect example of how Nosferatu uses that implied horror to
Right.
create the sense of dread. And that technique, which Murnau pioneered, has been so influential on horror filmmaking ever since.
It's amazing how a film made in 1922 without any special effects or gore can still be so terrifying.
It's a power of atmosphere, of suggestion, tapping into those primal fears that we all have.
Well, and it's not just limited to, one or two directors. You can see Nosferatu's DNA in the work of so many filmmakers.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, think about Alfred Hitchcock.
Yeah.
His masterful use of suspense.
Right.
He builds tension through suggestion and off-screen threat. Psycho, for example. You never actually see the stabbing in the shower, but the implication, the sound design, the quick cuts, it's far more terrifying than anything graphic could ever be.
Oh, yes.
Yeah, and then you have somebody like Guillermo del Toro, who's obsessed with monsters and the grotesque. But his films are also incredibly beautiful and poetic. And there's a clear lineage back to Nosferatu in the way that he blends horror and beauty, the human and the monstrous.
And then, of course, you can't forget about Werner Herzog, who directed his own remake of Nosferatu in 1979.
Oh, yes, Herzog's Nosferatu the Vampire.
But it's not just a shot-for-shot remake, is it?
No, not at all. Herzog takes that basic story and infuses it with his own unique vision.
I've heard it's both like a homage to the original, but also its own distinct interpretation.
Exactly. It's a visually stunning film. And Klaus Kinski gives just an unforgettable performance as Dracula. I mean, he's terrifying, of course.
Yeah.
But there's also this strange pathos to him, a sense of loneliness and longing that adds this whole new dimension to the character.
It's so cool how each filmmaker kind of finds something different in Nosferatu, something that speaks to their own kind of artistic sensibilities.
And that's what makes it such an enduring classic. It's a film that can be reinterpreted and reimagined endlessly, each generation finding new meaning in its shadows.
Well, and speaking of reinterpretations, there's that film Shadow of the Vampire, which takes a very different approach. It's like a fictionalized behind-the-scenes look at the making of the original Nosferatu.
Shadow of the Vampire.
Wow.
Such a brilliant film, a meta-horror film that blurs the lines between fiction and reality. The whole premise is that Max Schreck, the actor who played Orlok, was actually a real vampire.
It's so cool how that film plays with our fascination with Nosferatu. And the legend of Max Schreck. It's like the film itself has become the source of mythology and urban legend.
Well, and with each new adaptation or reinterpretation, the myth grows and evolves.
Which brings us to the upcoming reboot in 2024, directed by Robert Eggers. I'm curious to hear your thoughts. What do you think we can expect from his take on Nosferatu?
Well, given Eggers' previous work, like The Witch and The Lighthouse, I think it's safe to say we're in for something special. A visually stunning and psychologically disturbing experience. He just has this amazing ability to create these immersive, atmospheric films that really get under your skin.
Oh, for sure. And I mean, he's assembled an absolute phenomenal cast. For Nosferatu, Bill Skarsgård as Count Orlok, Willem Dafoe in a supporting role. I mean, I have no doubt that this film is going to be a worthy addition to the Nosferatu legacy.
Yeah.
It's wild to think that a film made in 1922 is still spawning remakes and reinterpretations 100 years later. What is it about Nosferatu that keeps audiences coming back?
Well, I think it's a combination of these timeless themes and that really striking, unforgettable imagery. The film taps into these primal fears, the fear of disease, of the unknown, of death itself, and those fears are just as relevant today as they were back then.
And, I mean, come on, that image of Count Orlok with his long shadow and pointed ears, it's just become so iconic.
Absolutely. It's instantly recognizable, even to people who've never even seen the film.
Yeah.
And that just speaks to the power of visual storytelling.
But Nosferatu isn't just a horror movie, is it? I've been reading some academic analyses that suggest that there's a lot more going on. You know that the film is also kind of a reflection of deeper social and political anxieties.
Oh, absolutely. There's a whole layer of meaning in Nosferatu that goes way beyond the surface level. Academics have explored themes of xenophobia, the fear of the other, which was really relevant in post-war Germany, a country that was struggling with its national identity and social upheaval.
So Nosferatu is like a mirror, reflecting the anxieties of its time.
Exactly.
But also a window into our own contemporary fears.
Precisely. And that's what makes it such a rich text, a film that works on multiple levels, offering different layers of meaning depending on who's watching and when.
It's amazing how a single film can have such a lasting impact, not just on cinema, but on our culture as a whole.
It really is. It's a testament to the power of art, to transcend time and connect with audiences across generations.
You mentioned xenophobia earlier,
Yeah.
and one of the articles you sent me talked about how Count Orlok is this outsider. He comes to Germany and just wreaks havoc. It's like he represents this invasive force that just disrupts the established order.
Yeah, it's a really interesting point. I mean, that fear of the other,
Yeah.
of this outsider who comes in and disrupts everything, it was very much present in post-war Germany. I mean, the
Hmm.
country was struggling with so much economic instability, political uncertainty, a sense of national identity that was in crisis.
So it's like Orlok becomes this scapegoat, this symbol for everything that's wrong with society.
Yeah, in a way,
Yeah.
he really embodies all those anxieties about invasion, contagion, the loss of control.
Hmm.
And what's interesting is how often those fears are projected onto people who are different, people who don't conform to societal norms.
Right. So Nosferatu isn't just a horror movie then. It's a commentary on these social and political anxieties.
Exactly.
And I guess those anxieties are often reflected in the way that we portray monsters in film.
Oh, absolutely. Think about it. Monsters often represent what we fear the most, whether it's the unknown, the uncontrollable, or the forces that threaten our way of life.
So we can learn a lot about ourselves
Yeah.
and the fears that shape our culture by examining the monsters in our stories.
Exactly. And Nosferatu is a perfect example of that. It taps into these deep-seated anxieties about disease, invasion, societal collapse. Anxieties that are still so relevant today.
It's like the film is holding up this mirror to our own fears a century later.
And that's why it's such an enduring classic. It speaks to these anxieties that are universal. They just transcend time and place.
Okay, so we've talked about the historical context, the visual style, the lasting influence, even the deeper social commentary of Nosferatu.
Right.
But I'm curious, what was the one thing that really struck you about Nosferatu as you were going through all these materials?
I think what really surprised me is just how much this film has seeped into our collective consciousness. Like, even if you've never seen Nosferatu, you probably recognize Count Orlok's image. He's become this pop culture icon, this shorthand for the whole vampire myth.
Yeah, he's on T-shirts, posters, coffee mugs. I mean, you see references to him everywhere.
And that speaks to the power of that visual storytelling. Murnau created this image that's both terrifying and strangely compelling, an image that has stayed with us for over a century.
It makes you wonder, what is it about vampires and Nosferatu in particular that continues to fascinate us?
I think it's this combination of fear and fascination. Vampires represent this dark, seductive power, a transgression of the boundaries between life and death. They embody our deepest fears, but also maybe some of our hidden desires.
And Nosferatu takes that fascination and twists it into something really unsettling. It strips away the romanticism of the vampire myth and gives us something raw, primal, deeply disturbing.
And in doing so, it reveals something about our own humanity, about our capacity for both darkness and light.
So for our listeners out there, what's the takeaway from this deep dive into Nosferatu?
I'd say the key takeaway is that horror, when it's done well, can be more than just entertainment. It can be a reflection of ourselves, of our fears and anxieties, the darkness that we all have lurking beneath the surface.
Nosferatu is a masterclass in doing horror right. It's terrifying, it's thought-provoking. It's a film that stays with you long after you've seen it.
As you watch it, pay attention to the shadows, because they're not just there for visual effect. They're metaphors for the unseen forces that shape our lives, for the fears that haunt us, and for the darkness that I think exists within us all.
Well, that just about wraps up our deep dive into Nosferatu. We've explored its historical context, its visual style, its lasting influence, even the deeper social commentary.
It's been a fascinating journey, exploring a film that continues to captivate and terrify audiences over a century later.
If you're interested in learning more, we encourage you to check out Nosferatu, especially if you've never seen it before. It's a truly unique and unforgettable experience.
You might even find yourself looking at shadows a little differently afterwards.
That's it for this deep dive. Until next time, stay curious and keep exploring